In Acts chapter 27, 276 people boarded a grain ship, assuming they would take a simple trip, travel for about 40 miles to Crete, and then they would be able there to winter and stay in that safe haven. As often happens in life, those 276 people who thought they were taking a half-day sail found themselves under extremely difficult and hazardous weather and 2 weeks of sheer, terrifying, horrible conditions, fighting for every fragment and every aspect and definition of their very survival. In the process, losing all the contents of the ship and the ship itself. But under the providential hand of God, not a single life was lost. When they left Fair Havens to start that what was supposed to be a half-day journey, a centurion leader and the captain were making all the decisions and calling all the shots. They were the clearly defined, legitimate leaders on this voyage. 2 weeks later, after fighting for their lives and their very survival, and God actually directly speaking and said, the only reason anybody survives this shipwreck is because I want the Apostle Paul to go to Rome. And Paul becomes the catalyst for the salvation of the entire crew, prisoners, and everybody on board. And the clear standout, obvious, anointed leader. And we conclude chapter 27, and in chapter 28, we have this brief parenthetical moment of reprise and respite where we find themselves now, after having lost the complete ship, after having to drift some on boards and some on other implements and some attempting to swim onto shore, onto beach of a small island that they have absolutely no idea where they're at, whether there's inhabitants or not. And in the very first part of chapter 28, we find out that they're actually south of Italy on a very small island called Malta, and that the people are actually a very generous and hospitable group of people. And finally, after 2 weeks of this horrible ordeal, they have a moment for rest. And I want to, in the remaining time, just pull out two or three, four possibly different things to keep in mind when we have those moments in our lives that are so difficult that we find a moment of rest. We find a moment of respite. We find ourselves where we can take a breath, a deep breath, hopefully, and not retreat, and recognize, as we have talked about repeatedly in this series, that it is still too soon to quit. This is how that story plays out in Acts chapter 28 in those first 11 verses. Luke is still writing a first-hand account because he is there with the Apostle Paul. He will stay with the Apostle Paul the remainder of Paul's life. Once safely ashore, this is Acts chapter 28, verse 1. Once safely ashore, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The local people showed us extraordinary kindness. They lit a fire and took us all in, since it was raining and cold. And Paul gathered a bundle of brushwood and put it on the fire. A viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the local people saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "This man, no doubt, is a murderer. Even though he has escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But he, referring to Paul, shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no harm. They expected that he would begin to swell up or suddenly drop dead. After they waited a long time and saw nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said, "He is a god." What a transformation. Murderer to God in just a few moments. Now in the area around that place was an estate belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Publius's father was in bed suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went to him, and praying and laying his hands on him, he healed him. After this, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. So they heaped many honors on us, and when we sailed, they gave us what we needed. After 3 months, we set sail in an Alexandrian ship that had wintered at the island with 2 twin gods as its figurehead. You just got to think that Paul and those 276 individuals are just glad there's a break. I mean, we understand. We have experienced physically what they've experienced. We've experienced it this past summer. We understand that the weather can change instantly. And I grew up with that fear in the desert. I couldn't tell you how many times throughout my life I have been warned over and over again, don't go into the arroyos, be careful into the canyons, because it doesn't even have to be raining where you are, and a flash flood can come from upstream where it is raining and overtake you. Whether it was in Boy Scouts or whether it was mountaineering with my dad, whether it was doing the activities that I love to do outdoors, the one thing over and over and over again that I was taught and ingrained into my mind and into my heart is to be prepared. But let's be honest. Not every storm in life can you be prepared for. And it can be overwhelming. But in the midst of that storm, one of the ways that we accomplish not giving in or being completely overwhelmed, or as to use what physically is taking place in Paul's case, not drowning in the midst of the storm and in the midst of the disaster, in the midst of the catastrophe, one of the ways we do that is to understand how we find our moments to recalibrate, reset ourselves, and in doing so, be prepared to refuse to retreat. Because we don't give up. We don't stop. And especially as a church, as a believer in Christ, we don't have to. Because our God is greater than the storms. And his love for us is not defined by the storms. And he is willing to intervene in the midst of the storms, whether we deserve it or not. And he's able to intervene on our behalf because of his simple love. So 4 real quick things to consider. Take time to recover. They're finally on shore in verses 1 and 2. They're finally on shore. They're finally on dry ground. They're finally not in threat of their lives. And the picture unfolds. The people there are extremely nice. They're very kind. Luke describes them as extraordinarily kind. And they simply lit a fire because the conditions after the storm were still cold and wet and it was still raining. Take time to recover. And I'm not going to attempt to define that in a specific way, but you understand. Just take a moment. Whether that means you need to stop for a moment, take a day off, and just be at home alone. Whether it means you need to take some time off and go to some other destination. Whether it means you need to take a breath in the middle of that moment. Just take the breath. And that seems so simple. I mean, even preparing the message and looking at what's taking place, it seems so simple. It seems so ordinary that they simply got on shore, and once they recognized where they were, and once they met the inhabitants of this island, the simple response was to stop and build a fire, sit around the fire pit for a little bit. I'm going to assume there's some food involved here. Just take a moment to recover. So simple. But the reality is most of us, when we're in crisis, we get on a treadmill sort of crisis mode and we don't simply step off. My daughter for years had this gerbil and we would watch it and it would just run on that thing nonstop. And I thought of all the stupid creatures. If it would just for a moment step, like literally one step, in this particular gerbil's case, one roll, because I think it had lost its legs somewhere along the way, and just the obesity overwhelmed it. I got along with the gerbil. We had a lot in common. Then I realized if that's me, if I am in crisis, if I am stressed out, if I am struggling with something, I just run harder. Part of that's my personality, part of that's my mix-up, part of it's my family of origins, part of it's my sin, just all the things come together. But running harder doesn't ever get you there. Sometimes you just got to stop take a breath, and relax. You need the opportunity to regroup so that you can gain perspective, because just because one storm's over, what we have seen in the book of Acts, especially these last 5 to 6 chapters, what we have seen is as soon as we get rid of one storm, there's another one on the horizon. The Apostle Paul has had just a horrible life in the last 5 or 6 chapters. We've gone from trial after trial after trial, false accusation after false accusation, to shipwreck. And now, as he's resting, as he's relaxing, I love the humility of the Apostle Paul in verse 3. He's the only reason anybody survived the shipwreck. And yet, where do we find him in verse 3? We find him out gathering wood for the bonfire. He could have sat back, said, I warned you guys. I mean, he could be having his whole little session here. I told you so. I warned you. I knew this was, God only, how many of us, if we're honest, don't raise your hand, would want to look and say, the only reason you're alive is because God likes me more than you. My dog's better than your dog. That's our tendency. But that's not what the Apostle Paul does. As a part of recovery, as a part of regrouping, he is doing the humblest of tasks, the simplest of tasks. He's gathering firewood. And as if his life feels cursed, as he's gathering the firewood, he goes to place it on the fire. And when he places it on the fire, a pit viper, we don't have the exact definition of which species it was, feels the heat, senses the heat, comes out and bites him and is now hanging from his hand. You can't really blame the people for thinking there's something really wrong with this guy. He managed to escape the sea, but now he's going to die by snake bite. But you have to remember, we understand Paul's faith, and Paul has heard the angels say to him repeatedly, and he sensed the Holy Spirit saying to him repeatedly, look, I have a task for you to do, and nothing's going to happen to you until that task is done. So Paul just shakes it off into the fire and keeps moving. Take some time to recover. Characterize humility in our lives and understand we just may need to regroup, because we don't know what's ahead. We don't know what's going to happen this afternoon. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I'm not saying you should live with this perpetual idea that there's just some pending storm waiting to happen. But just take time to regroup. Absolutely essential, and this is so important for us as a church, is we have to be able to relate. We have to be able to engage in community, and we have to be able and willing to touch other people's lives. They go from the bonfire, and Paul doesn't die because of the snake. And they find that there's a man living in the area who has an estate, and he is the leading man on the island. Publius is here, and he welcomes them to his home. And he begins to entertain them for 3 days, an extended visit, an extended time together. And again, that's a part of the recovery. That's a part of the regrouping. I would encourage you absolutely to make sure you have friends and someone you can talk to, someone you can be with, someone you can pray, that can pray for you, someone that's involved, someone that's connected. Probably the most specific and closest is going to be the small group that you're a part of in the context of your faith and your church experience. You have to relate. But we don't stop touching others. Taking a moment, regrouping, so that we can figure out what we're going to do next doesn't mean that we're off call, that we're off mission. It turns out that while they're enjoying the party and the celebration and the entertainment that's taking place at Publius' house, while they're enjoying all of that, it turns out his dad is extremely ill. I'm not going to go into the details of it. You're more than welcome to look up dysentery in the dictionary. Grossed me out. It's not a disease I want to have, and not a pleasant disease for anybody to experience. The Apostle Paul, who's in recovery mode at this point, makes the decision to go to the man, to pray for the man, and the man becomes healed. The indication in the original language is that it is an instantaneous healing. That while Paul has his hands on the man, he is healed. And the word gets out. Something like this takes place. You've already got people thinking he's a god, thinking he's a murderer. Now they've seen a snake bite him, so now he's immune to poisonous snakes. And now he's just healed this leading man's father from a serious disease. So what do you expect? They start showing up. And they want to. We saw this pattern in the life of Jesus as well. When they hear this, they started coming. The rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. We are designed to be together. We need time alone, but we are designed to be able to relate. And we are called in our salvation to touch other people's lives. Recover, take the time, regroup, but never forget to relate. Don't isolate off. Don't move into some position where there's no connection any longer. And don't stop ever being on mission. Not as a part of that treadmill, not as a part of that rolling wheel that never arrives, never gets anywhere, but as a recognition that that's who Jesus was and that's who Jesus wants to be through us. And then simply, in the process of this recovery, just resupply and keep momentum. In verse 10 it says, they heaped honors on us, and when we sailed, they gave us what we needed. I don't know about you, but after this experience, the last thing I would want to do is be on a ship. But yet, 3 months have passed, and it's time for them to depart. It's time to get on another ship because theirs was destroyed, and it's time to move forward and go to Rome, which is where God has called Paul to go. We must take time sometimes to just recover. We must regroup and rethink our strategy and our plan and do so with humility. We must never stop relating because we need one another, and ministry needs to take place even out of, in fact, oftentimes out of our own misery and suffering and sorrows. We become better ministers. So we accomplish that. But just know with a sense of faith, it's not over. It is, as we've talked about in this series, too soon to quit. Keep the momentum. Keep moving forward. Resupply and take the help and assistance from your friends, but keep moving forward. With the power of Christ, no setback has to be terminal and final. We understand that. When we show up to the grave 3 days after the execution of Christ and we find it empty, and angels say, why are you looking for the living amongst the dead? He is not here. He is alive. Thanks to Jesus, no setback is permanent. Trust him for the next step. Let's stand together.